Hey everybody, welcome to, hope everybody's doing okay tonight. It is Wednesday and it's a hot day here in Savannah. And welcome to Design Thinking Project Planning Deep Dives. We're going to be talking a little bit tonight about the CREATOMsetgo Project Planning Wizard, and especially doing a deep dive into the Project Planning Design Canvas and sort of how do you go about breaking that down. Again, if you want to follow along in the chat, there's two different ways you can do that. You can go ahead and either log into YouTube and create your own channel and participate in the live chat, or you can go about going to Twitter and following the hashtag DTCSG. So let's see how we're doing here. Okay. So we're going to get started here and we'll move on to the next screen here. All right. So one of the things that we're looking at here is really looking at a deep dive for project planning and really looking at what is design thinking. And for me, there is, how I really look at it is that, design thinking is kind of this really messy process, and I think a lot about Harold and the Purple Crayon, and some of you might be familiar with that. And so with Harold and the Purple Crayon, like, he kind of got himself into trouble because he went off on some kind of really big adventure. And what happened was he developed like his own city in space. Well, it's kind of like that, and then he was looking for his own bedroom. And so the design process is a little bit like that kind of process. To look at a really firm definition of it, looking at design thinking, it concludes a methodology around solving complex problems and draws upon logic, imagination, intuition, and systemic reasoning to explore the possibilities of what could be and to create desired outcomes that benefit an end user. And in design, we talk a lot about what an end user is. So an end user can be anybody from an organization like the government to an individual. It could be a student who's trying to interface with a learning management system. It could be a teacher trying to participate in professional learning. So an end user is the person who's going to be the person receiving the services or the products that's going to be used. So bringing back sort of the purple crayon, this was the image that I discovered when I was in grad school. And it's sort of looking at, sort of this uncertainty of the research and the concept and the design process. So you start off very early on with looking at uncertainty in the patterns, you start gathering insights, and eventually, once all that mess happens, you start moving into some sort of idea of a concept, and you go back and forth with your client, and you're working together to figure out like what's the best way to approach a problem. And then eventually you stick to one way to approach that problem, and then you end up coming up with a solution, and that's what a design is. So the Stanford D School, a lot of people might be familiar with this particular type of diagram, is really looking at a way to sort of bring it more into a simplified version. So it kind of decodes it into looking at empathy, how do you define the problem, that becomes part of that research. You start looking at ideating or imagining what's happening, and then you start prototyping a possible solution, and that becomes the period of time where you're actually making something. And then there's that testing of the design. So the design's either been delivered into the marketplace and people are giving feedback on it, whether it's through purchasing it, or even for like a student, like they're being tested on their knowledge or they're presenting to an authentic audience. So that's when I think people start getting a little overwhelmed though, and so just like Harold kind of sinking underneath the ocean, kind of in over his head, because I think for a lot of people it tends to be a really difficult process, looking at the design thinking process. So one of the things that I did is I went about looking at breaking down and decoding that design thinking process in a way that teachers could understand it and be able to bring it into their classroom. So some of you who may have seen this before, the project design wizard called CREATOMsetgo. So we're really going to focus in right over here on the canvas for most part, but I'm going to go through all the parts that we have. So the canvas here, this was something that I was asked to do by a group of 5th grade teachers at Centennial Elementary, or Centennial Academy in Atlanta, Georgia. And what they wanted was something they could give their students so they could follow along. And from that, they then started talking about, like, hey, could you help us out with some different types of project types? And also, then could you help explain to us some of the design processes in sort of short bites of information, so that way they could sort of digest it in a little bit more easy way. So in looking at the project design canvas, what we started looking at was, how do we start breaking this thing down? And so we looked at sort of 3 really big areas: ask, make, and share. And then within each one of those, having 3 sort of very distinctive processes that you go through. And so really looking at the research component, the concept component, and then the testing component. And if we were going to go about looking at how this sort of leverages or aligns with the design thinking process, we're really looking at really bringing that definition in that discovery mode, looking at empathy in inquiry, and looking at ideation in the imagine sort of component. In the make side, again, we're still defining what the problem is and how we're going to be able to go plan to attack, and we're bringing in that prototyping and testing when we're going through and iterating and making it better. And then we're communicating it again and presenting it, and then also having reflection. So I want to focus in pretty much, first of all, on that whole ask component. What are we doing there with asking? So one of the things I thought that would be really helpful is to look at, as we're moving through each one of the parts of the project, we're really looking at 3 very distinctive things as a teacher is planning the actual project design. So as teachers are planning the project design, we're first really looking at, we're discovering what kind of projects do you actually want to explore in the classroom, like what's going to be able to engage your students and create some sort of challenge for them, or some level of problem identification that they can be able to go and engage with over a long period of time. And with the inquiry of what teachers are looking for, is that they're looking at, like, how do their standards and their curriculum actually can be leveraged for exploring a very specific problem. So we're looking at, like, how to create some essential questions. We're looking at, how do we go about looking at putting together different kinds of ways to engage students through creating driving questions. And that driving question really can be helpful in being able to leverage all the curriculum that's around you to be able to map out ideas. And one of the things that we do is, with a lot of workshops, is that we work on mapping out the connections between the curriculum, because sometimes we're not really sure what kind of questions we could be asking students. And so there might be some really simple things that kind of come together. So in this instance that you see here with survival, you're really looking at, I put out a question to a bunch of teachers, like, how do you survive in an extreme environment? And what they did here is they looked at all of the different ways that survival is approached within the different subject areas in math, and language arts, and social studies, and in science. And they pulled that whole entire thing apart based on a number of pieces within their curriculum. So at one time they were looking at, the settling of America, and how did the economics play into survival? How did we look at things like supply and demand? We looked at taxation and economics, and they sort of built a big project kind of based around that kind of idea of, like, how would the colonies survive? And that's where they took their project. And from that they looked at, well, how can we express this in through our ELA standards, and then how do we go about looking at the technology that kind of came at that same time of the colonizing of the United States. So they really started bringing in and started leveraging all of the curriculum, even though it wasn't necessarily perfectly aligned within their own sort of standards or their own scope and sequences. So as you're starting to look at planning for your project. We're really looking at planning, creating, and iterating on our actual project proposals as teachers before we actually go into delivering in the classroom. And so in doing this, we're really looking at, first of all, who is on our teaching team. This is really important to understand, like, who are the different people what we're going to be able to bring together. Are we looking at, maybe science and math might be your leads, but there might be an ELA support? Or is it something like a social studies and a science project, and then you're going to go and maybe work with your art department, or bring in maybe your, or bring in somebody like your English language to be able to go and support that project as well. Then we start really looking at, well, what's the lens that we're actually going to go and put that project into? And so when we talk about a lens, especially in design, we're really thinking about kind of like typology. So a project typology would look a lot like, we're going to do a storytelling project, or we're going to do something like a cultural study, or we're going to do a STEAM discovery. And so when you start looking at what happens around that project, you're sort of taking that lens. So it's almost like who's taking the lead. So science is going to take the lead. We're going to use a scientific lens to look at it through. And with that, really looking at that creation part of your project, what's your flow of activities, what kind of group products or individual products that you want your students to be able to produce. And then as you're thinking about how will my students iterate on this, or how will my students give and receive feedback, really starting figuring out what formative and summative assessments can align with your different products that happen at different times. So this might sound very familiar with project-based learning or problem-based learning, and what can happen is that you can start using this design thinking process, and it fits pretty naturally within a problem-based or a project-based, inquiry-based kind of learning experience. So one of the ways that we approached it is we developed 6 different project types that allow for teachers to kind of get their heads wrapped around, whether it's a STEAM discovery, it's that kind of lens. Are you looking at maybe a service learning project, or something like building a business, or telling stories? And from that, we helped teachers to be able to figure out the activities or a basic kind of workflow throughout that project, through looking at kind of our project menus. And over here, where I'm pointing through, here are all the different phases that we're working through, the ask, make, and share. And then we're looking at the different types of activities you could be doing. These are kind of color-coded. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a list that's gotten started. And the way that we've sort of looked at the way that the cards are kind of broken up is that, we're really doing things where there's engagement events that happen. These could be field trips that you might want to plan for as you're designing your project. It may end up, processes or scaffolds. I've heard teachers use scaffolding as a interesting way. So like these yellow cards are kind of scaffoldings where there are different processes you might go through. The red cards are products, so the types of things that students would actually deliver, and they might receive either a formative or a summative assessment on, as well as feedback. And so looking at sort of pairing and sharing, it could be critiques, it could be students keeping a journal, so having these reflection activities. And the way that we sort of help out with is, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, we actually give you sort of these bite-sized pieces of information that help to be able to put those activities and be able to think about it quickly when you're working on a team. So one of the things that we find is that building projects with a team is probably one of the most, I think, beneficial ways of being able to understand how to use design thinking within your project and within your project design. When you have people to discuss this with, and you're able to sort of negotiate back and forth, you're able to decide, well, what activities might go better with other activities. And I think it gets really hard doing design thinking in a silo where it's just, I'm going to be at, I think it's the same way we think about, if we have to plan and we're overwhelmed by planning, projects all by ourselves within our schools. That being able to have a team to rely on, to be able to get really good feedback, to be able to discuss the design of your project, and also to be able to get feedback one another is really critical. What I usually do in order to facilitate that kind of feedback is I look at being able to bring teachers into a space where they're actually communicating their project, and either that's through a series of proposals, they're presenting it usually to a group, and then there's a group reflection. So in communicating it, when you're developing your proposals, work with your team and set really clear learning objectives, and develop your proposals to include things like what standards are you going to accomplish in this particular project, or what kind of assessments you plan to use, what kind of engagement event do you want to be able to hold to kind of kick off this event. Are there resources outside of the school you might want to leverage? And so to be able to communicate what your project proposal is, a lot of times we'll end up using something like a large kind of poster session. And with those poster sessions, or we've done sometimes like fast pitches, where teachers have gone up and they've created a slideshow about their project proposal. And so being able to share that out through some sort of interactive means, whether it's sending it out through Google Docs, or whether it's being able to bring together like your whole department to be able to go and work together and be able to give each other feedback. It's really important that you're able to provide some sort of process in that reflection component after you've shared it, where you're able to get feedback on the proposal, and you're able to go through whatever your school's tuning protocols are and whatever your team's tuning protocols are in order to improve that particular project. And so here are some teachers who are working on doing just that, and they're in this case they're actually working on a big poster proposal. And so they're writing down all the different things. They've taken lots of notes. They're looking at what their products might be, their content. Is there a driving question that they've come up with, or a certain line of inquiry? And then they're fine-tuning that. And then what we've done is we've gone and brought it into a gallery type session where everybody is going through and presenting their proposals, and everybody gets a chance to sort of look at, well, what are they doing in second grade as compared to what are they doing in fifth grade, or what are they doing in science as compared to what they're doing in social studies. And then what I'm having teachers do in this particular photograph is I'm having them actually write on sticky notes backwards, so the sticky side is down, and they're writing about, what do they really like about that proposal that team put together. They're writing down comments about what they're still kind of not sure about in the proposal and they need clarification. And then they're also writing about giving some suggestions to other teachers about, you might want to think about what have you thought about including this, or what about this resource. So that can be a really good way to be able to go and give feedback. And this, again, can be done on a Google Doc. It can be done on a blog and blog commenting. It can also happen in that way. So pretty much done with the presentation. So let's open it up to any kind of live chat if anybody is interested in or has any questions that they might have questions about. And if people are, again, you can post your questions on at the hashtag DTCSG on Twitter if you have any questions. So we'll wait a few minutes and see if anybody has a question that they might want to ask, or any kind of clarification that you might have. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. This will be posted up on the YouTube channel in case you want to go back through it. I know it's probably a lot of information, and being able to look at how you can go about incorporating design thinking within designing your future projects. Again, if you want to contact me in the future, you can reach me. I'll put it in the chat here. You can always contact me. So at Fritz at CREATOMbuilder.com. In case you need to get a hold of me for anything or if you have any questions. All right. Thanks, everybody.